He didn't say it on a balcony. He didn't whisper it in a moment of grief. He said it when no cameras were rolling, when the weight of the future king finally became too heavy to carry. What if the man who was destined to rule an entire nation quietly admitted he never wanted the crown at all? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. For a moment, imagine the most composed royal in modern history. The one who never falters, never slips, never reveals a crack, finally reaching the point where silence was no longer possible. Imagine the future king of England looking at someone he trusted and saying the words no one ever expected to hear. "I never wanted this life. I wanted out." Those weren't dramatic lines from a movie. They weren't part of a public speech. They weren't even supposed to exist beyond the four walls where they were spoken. So how did they escape? And more importantly, why now? Because something has shifted. Not in the headlines. Not in the press releases. In him. You've seen it. Even if you didn't notice it at first. The subtle changes in expression, the quieter tone, the way responsibility has begun to sit differently on his shoulders. It's the kind of transformation that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures, but with tiny fractures that eventually reveal a bigger truth. For decades, Prince William has been presented as the steady one, the unshakable one, the royal who would never question the path laid out for him before he could speak his first word. But what happens when the world discovers that even the most carefully groomed heir is still human? That's the part no one was prepared for. Because the confession wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about refusing duty. It was about something far more unsettling. The burden of being born into a life you never chose. And if you stop for a second, you might ask yourself the same question millions are now silently wondering. What would drive a man who is everything, power, privilege, legacy, to secretly wish for a completely different life? That's where this story begins. Not with a scandal, not with a headline, but with a moment of truth that shook the one person who heard it, and eventually shook the entire United Kingdom. Why this matters now is not because of what was said, but because of what it means. In recent months, a change has unfolded, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Royal insiders have been whispering about a shift in William's energy, a growing tension around decisions being made behind closed doors, and the sense that something happened, something that altered the course of the future more than the public will ever be told. People assumed it was stress. They assumed it was grief. They assumed it was the pressure of preparing for a role he has been groomed for since birth. But they were wrong. This wasn't a temporary crisis. It wasn't a momentary doubt. It was the resurfacing of a truth he has carried for years. A truth that didn't begin in adulthood, but long before he ever understood what the word destiny meant. And here's the unsettling part. This confession didn't come out of nowhere. There were signs. Small ones. Quiet ones. Moments that slipped through the polished royal image and went unnoticed by almost everyone. Except the one person who later heard him say the words out loud. But before we reach that moment, you need to understand one thing. This story is not just about a prince who struggled with the weight of expectation. It's about what happens when the life you are born into becomes the life that slowly suffocates you. Not physically, but emotionally, silently, relentlessly. Most people dream of becoming royalty. Prince William was born into it and spent years trying to find a way to feel like himself inside a life that never belonged to him. And if that sounds dramatic, ask yourself this. How do you escape something you cannot leave? How do you change a destiny that was written before you existed? You don't. Not publicly, anyway. Which is why what happened next changed everything. Because for the first time, not as a prince, not as an heir, but as a man, William reached a point where the truth could no longer stay hidden. But the world wouldn't learn about it from him. Not yet. Instead, the first person to know was someone who never expected to hear those words. Someone who thought they understood him better than anyone else. Until that moment. And that's when everything quietly began to unravel. Because once a truth like that is spoken, it can't be taken back. And the question that no one in the UK ever thought to ask suddenly became impossible to ignore. If Prince William didn't choose this life, what happens when the moment comes for him to wear the crown anyway? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. I have not reached 2,000 words yet. Say go when you're ready for me to continue the introduction. You said, go. ChatGPT said, continuing the introduction. I will stop again before hitting the platform limit. If it still isn't 2,000 words, just say go again. People assume royalty means freedom, but the truth is the opposite. Most people get to decide who they become. William never had that luxury, not even for a second. From the moment he opened his eyes in the hospital room, cameras were already waiting. The world already had plans for him before he could form his own. Every smile, every step, every mistake, documented, analyzed, stored forever. Imagine growing up with millions of strangers convinced they know you, while you barely know yourself. Now picture trying to breathe under that. There's a reason this confession feels different from every royal headline you've ever heard. It didn't come from scandal or rage. It came from exhaustion, the kind that doesn't show up in public but slowly builds in silence. And it didn't happen overnight. To understand how the future king reached a moment where he whispered the words I wanted out, you have to go back. Not to the glamour, not to the ceremonies, but to the hidden spaces no one sees. The quiet corridors, the rooms without cameras. The moments when the prince becomes just a human being sitting alone with thoughts no one expects him to have. Because long before the world heard whispers of a confession, the pressure had already begun tightening around him like a closed fist. As a child, he was told the world needed him. As a teenager, he was told the country depended on him. As an adult, he was told he must never fail. What does that do to someone? Most people learn who they are by trying, failing, changing direction. William didn't get that process. His identity came pre-written, and the more the world decided who he was, the less room he had to figure it out for himself. So he adapted. He stayed composed. He became the dependable one, the steady one, the royal who would never crack. But here's the part no one realized. The more perfect he appeared, the more invisible his struggle became. Because perfection isn't real. It's a cage disguised as a compliment. Ask yourself something. If every person in your life only saw what they expected from you, not what you actually felt, how long could you survive inside that version of yourself? William survived decades, but not without a cost. And recently, that cost became impossible to hide, even from the people trained to ignore cracks in the royal surface. Those closest to him started noticing what the public missed. A hesitation in his voice, a distance in his eyes, a silence that didn't feel like calm anymore, but like something waiting to break. And here's where everything takes a turn. Because what happened wasn't just personal, it had consequences. Big ones. When an ordinary person questions their life path, it affects their household. When the future king of England does it, it affects an entire nation. That's why this moment matters now. It isn't just about a confession. It's about what the confession could mean. A monarchy isn't designed for uncertainty. It runs on stability, continuity, the belief that the next generation is ready and willing to step in without hesitation. So what happens when hesitation becomes undeniable? The answer terrified the people who heard it first. Because even though the public still sees a calm and composed air, behind closed doors a different reality has been unfolding, quietly, carefully, and with rising urgency. Someone saw the shift. Someone heard the first unfiltered admission. And someone realized this wasn't temporary. But before the confession ever reached that point, something triggered it. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a single conversation. It was years of carrying a role he never chose, until one moment pushed him past the line he had been balancing on since childhood. And that moment didn't happen during a public engagement or a royal event. It happened in private, when he believed no one would ever know. But the truth never stays buried. Not when the weight behind it is this heavy. There is a reason this story didn't leak through the press. It leaked through behavior, gradually, subtly, in ways no headline could trace, but no insider could ignore. A prince who once moved with certainty began pausing. A man who always seemed prepared began appearing distracted. And the heir who never questioned the path before him began quietly searching for something else, something the crown could never give him. It wasn't power. It wasn't sympathy. It was freedom. Not freedom from duties, but freedom to exist without being defined by them. That's the part most people miss. Prince William never wanted to run away from responsibility. He wanted something far more human, the ability to choose his life instead of inheriting it like a sentence. And when that truth finally surfaced, it didn't come out as anger, it came out as honesty. The kind that only appears when a person has carried the same secret for too long. But this was not the first time he questioned his place. It was simply the first time he allowed someone else to hear it. And that single choice, trusting one person with the truth, set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Because once someone hears the heir to the throne say he never wanted the crown, everything changes. Suddenly, silence becomes dangerous. Suddenly, the future becomes uncertain. Suddenly, the royal machine must decide whether to protect the institution or the man. And here's the twist. They couldn't do both. Which brings us to the moment at the heart of this story. The private space. The unexpected conversation. The words that broke through decades of silence. But we are not there yet. To understand why those words mattered, why they carried so much weight, you have to go back to the beginning of the shift. It didn't start with the confession. It started with something much quieter. A change so subtle that only one person noticed it. At first. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. At first, it was nothing more than a pause. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that draws attention. A small, barely noticeable hesitation. So brief that anyone else would have missed it entirely. But the person who saw it wasn't just anyone. They had known William for years. They had watched him grow, adapt, carry the weight of expectation without breaking. They knew his expressions, his tone, his default calm. So when the shift appeared, quiet, controlled, almost invisible, they felt it before they understood it. Because sometimes change announces itself not through noise, but through silence. Imagine this. A man who has always walked with purpose suddenly takes a moment before moving forward. Not long. Just long enough for someone close to ask a question they never thought they'd ask. Are you all right? Most of the time, those words are casual, polite, almost meaningless. But when they're spoken to someone who is never allowed to struggle, they become something else entirely. William didn't answer right away, and that silence said more than any response could. Because when a person who is trained to always be fine suddenly pauses, it means they no longer are. That was the first crack. Not an explosion. Not a breakdown. Just a moment that didn't fit the version of him the palace had polished for decades. From that point forward, the shift grew. Not in dramatic ways, but consistently. His schedule didn't change. His responsibilities didn't lessen. His composure didn't visibly crumble. But something internal had begun to move, slowly, steadily, like a tide that no longer followed the moon. And here's where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Because the people around him did what they were trained to do. They dismissed it, not out of coldness, not out of neglect, but because royalty is built on the belief that the heir must always cope, always continue, always absorb pressure without reaction. So instead of addressing the change, they waited for it to pass. But it didn't. In fact, the more they ignored it, the more it grew. Until one day, it reached the point where pretending became harder than admitting the truth. And that's when the moment happened. Not planned, not dramatic, not even intentional. A private conversation, ordinary at first, shifted into something no one in the room was prepared for. It began with a simple question, a harmless question, one that had been asked hundreds of times over the years. How are you holding up? But this time, the answer didn't come wrapped in the usual expected reassurance. This time, the truth slipped through. And once it did, there was no taking it back. I never wanted this life. 5 words. 5 words that carried decades of silence, expectation, and pressure. 5 words that changed how one person saw him forever. Think about that. The future king of England. Not complaining, not rebelling, just telling the truth. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. That's what made it so powerful. Because truth spoken in calmness hits harder than truth spoken in anger. The person listening didn't know what to say. How do you respond when the heir to the throne admits he never wanted the throne? There is no script for that. No protocol. No royal manual that explains what comes next. And here is where the real story begins. Not with the confession itself, but with the moment after it. Because as soon as those words were spoken, everything changed. Not in the public eye, not in the media, but in the atmosphere around him. The silence that followed was heavier than the confession itself. And what the listener realized in that moment was something far more shocking than the words they had just heard. This wasn't the first time he had thought it. It was only the first time he had said it out loud. Which means the struggle didn't start in that room. It started years earlier, hidden behind duty, responsibility, and expectation. And that raises the question no one wants to ask. How long had he been carrying that truth alone? Because a secret like that doesn't appear suddenly. It grows, quietly, steadily, until it finally demands to be heard. And once it is heard, it cannot be unheard. The person who listened was left with a truth they never expected to hold. They couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't forget it. And they couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. Because when the future king says he wanted out, even once, it changes the future. Not immediately, not publicly, but inevitably. That is why this moment matters now. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a crisis. It was the beginning of a shift that would eventually ripple through the monarchy itself. And it didn't stop there. Because after that confession, something else happened, something no one anticipated. William asked a question that stunned the person sitting across from him. A question that proved the confession wasn't just emotional, it was intentional. But we'll come back to that. For now, remember this. The world still sees a man who appears steady, calm, and prepared. But the people who know what was said behind closed doors understand the truth. He is not the same. Something has changed. And the consequences of that change are only just beginning to surface. Because words like "I want it out" don't stay contained forever. They echo. They complicate. They demand answers. And the answer to this confession is still unfolding, quietly, urgently, and far away from the cameras. But what happened next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. In the days that followed, nothing looked different on the surface. William attended engagements, smiled for cameras, shook hands, delivered speeches. The world saw the same composed future king they had always seen. But the person who heard the confession saw something else entirely. Because once you know the truth, you can't unsee the signs. A brief stare into the distance that lasted a fraction too long. A quiet exhale before entering a room. A practiced smile that no longer reached his eyes. Most people would have dismissed these moments as fatigue. But this wasn't exhaustion, it was realization. Realization that the truth was no longer a thought locked inside his mind. It now lived in the world. Shared, exposed, unavoidable. And when a truth is spoken for the first time, something fundamental shifts inside a person. They can no longer pretend. That was the change unfolding beneath the surface, slow but undeniable. Because William wasn't just admitting he wanted out. He was confronting what that meant. And here's the most startling part. He didn't seem relieved after saying it. He seemed afraid. Not afraid of backlash. Not afraid of judgment. Afraid of possibility. Because once you acknowledge a desire you've buried for decades, the question becomes unavoidable. What if change is actually possible? For most people, that thought would feel freeing. But for the heir to the British throne, possibility is dangerous. It challenges tradition. It disrupts expectation. It threatens stability. And the monarchy is not built to absorb uncertainty. Which is why what happened next sent quiet ripples through the people closest to him. Not because they knew what he said, no one else did. But because instinct told them something was shifting. You can't hide an internal transformation forever. Eventually, it leaks into presence. William started becoming more reflective, less automatic. He didn't speak less, but he spoke differently. Not distracted, aware. Like a man suddenly seeing his life from the outside for the first time. And that's when the questions began. Soft ones at first. Subtle. Almost harmless. Do you ever wish things were different? Have you ever imagined a life without all of this? Inside a royal household, those questions aren't casual. They're dangerous. Because curiosity inside the monarchy is treated the same way as instability, quietly contained. But the more he reflected, the more the truth grew. Not louder, clearer. It wasn't that he hated his role. It wasn't that he rejected responsibility. It was that he never got to choose. And choice is the one thing royalty can never offer. That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. A man born into the highest privilege in the nation, yet denied the most basic human freedom. The freedom to decide who he becomes. And if you think about it, that's the kind of pressure that doesn't explode, it erodes. Slowly, consistently, quietly, until one day, the weight becomes heavier than the silence holding it together. But here's where the story deepens. Because the confession wasn't the most shocking part. It was what came after. A moment that proved this wasn't just an emotional release. It was a turning point. One afternoon, in another private setting, the same person who heard the confession noticed a second shift. Not in his words, this time, in his eyes. There was clarity, not panic, not confusion. Clarity, like someone who had crossed an invisible line and could never return. And then William asked the question that would have been unthinkable coming from anyone else in the monarchy. A question that made the listener's heart stop cold. If someone wanted to step away, how would it even work? Not hypothetically, not academically, with genuine intent. The room went silent. Because that question wasn't about curiosity. It was about possibility. And possibility was the one thing the royal system was never designed to handle. In that moment, everything changed. Not in the press, not in parliament, not in public, but in the quiet understanding that the future might not unfold the way everyone assumed. Because if the heir to the throne was even considering the idea of stepping away, even in the faintest, most private way, it meant the foundation of the monarchy was no longer unshakable. It meant the future was no longer guaranteed. And the person listening realized something with chilling clarity. The confession was not the end. It was the beginning. A beginning that carried consequences no one could predict and no one was prepared to face. Which brings us to the question at the center of this entire story. What happens when the man destined to become king starts imagining a life without the crown? Because once that thought is born, it does not disappear. It waits. It grows. It returns. And the moment that thought returns with purpose is the moment everything changes, not just for him, but for the entire country watching from the outside, completely unaware of the truth unfolding behind palace walls. The world still thinks they know the path ahead, but they don't. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It didn't happen on a dramatic day. No royal crisis. No breaking news. No flashing cameras. It began on a morning that looked like every other morning in the royal calendar. But that's the thing about life-changing moments. They don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary. For most people, the day that changes everything becomes a memory they can point to instantly. For Prince William, it was a day no one else even noticed. Because from the outside, nothing was wrong. The sun was out. The schedule was full. The world was watching the heir who never faltered. But inside the walls of the palace, something subtle happened, so small that only one person sensed it. A shift, a pause, a moment that didn't fit the pattern. This is where the unraveling began. Not with words, not with confession, with silence. A silence that didn't feel like calm anymore, but like the space before a storm. Let's go back to that morning. It started the way royal mornings always start, structured, scheduled, predictable. William was preparing for another public appearance. Nothing unusual. He had done this thousands of times. He knew the routine better than he knew his own reflection. But today, something felt different. He stood still for a moment longer than anyone expected. Not frozen, just there. Present in a way he usually wasn't. Normally, William moved with automatic certainty, steps practiced, timing precise, presence polished. But on this day, he hesitated. Just long enough for someone in the room to look up. Not long enough to cause panic. Just long enough to create a question. Are you all right? A harmless question on any other day. A warning sign on this one. Because William didn't answer immediately. He inhaled, not deeply, not dramatically, but as if the air suddenly felt heavier. Then he nodded, quietly, automatically. But the nod didn't match the expression in his eyes. Most people wouldn't have seen it. But the person watching him wasn't most people. They had seen William through every version of himself. Child, teenager, young adult, husband, father, heir. They knew the difference between quiet and distant. And this wasn't quiet. It was something else. Something new. Something that didn't belong. But here's the part that makes this moment so important. Nothing external caused it. There was no confrontation. No bad news. No conflict. This shift came from inside. Like a truth rising to the surface after being buried for too long. Throughout the morning, the signs continued. Not loud, not alarming, just present. When someone spoke to him, he responded, but slower. When laughter filled the room, he smiled, but faintly. When instructions were given, he followed. But with a delay that didn't fit the rhythm. It was as if the world around him was moving at the usual pace. But he wasn't moving with it. And here's where the tension begins. In a normal family, someone would have pulled him aside. In a royal family, people are trained not to notice. Silence is easier. Assumption is safer. Personal emotion is treated like a rumor, acknowledged only if absolutely necessary. So no one said anything. No one asked again. No one wondered why the heir to the throne suddenly looked like a man standing inside his own life instead of living it. But the person who noticed didn't forget. Because once you see something you're not supposed to see, you can't ignore it. The day continued as planned. Cars arrived. Security prepared. Schedules moved forward. William stepped into the vehicle like he had done thousands of times before. But even then, another pause. Just a fraction of a second. A hand resting on the door frame longer than needed. Not dramatic, just human. As if he needed one more moment before entering the world that belonged to everyone but him. And that's when the realization began for the person watching. Something was changing, not around William, but inside him. Not temporarily, not from stress, but from reaching a threshold. Because people don't shift like that unless something internal has been building for a long time. For years, William had been the definition of composure. The reliable one, the steady one, the royal who never allowed the weight to show. But even stone erodes. Not with force, with time. And that morning, time finally revealed what pressure had been hiding. The day unfolded publicly the way the world expected. He greeted crowds, smiled for cameras, delivered his lines with precision. No one watching noticed anything unusual. But the person who had seen the hesitation earlier recognized the truth hidden beneath the performance. William was functioning perfectly, but he wasn't present. His body was in the moment, but something in his mind was somewhere else entirely. And that is more revealing than any words he could have spoken. Because when a person who has always been fully in control begins moving through life on autopilot, it means something inside them has shifted. Not breaking, changing. But here's the part that turned this quiet moment into the beginning of a much larger story. This wasn't a bad day. This was the first day someone realized he was no longer the man he used to be. And once that realization forms, even silently, it changes the way every future moment is seen. Because now the question existed. What happened to him? No one asked. No one confronted him. No one intervened. But someone saw the change. And that's all it takes for a secret to begin unraveling. Not exposure, recognition. Because when the first witness exists, the truth is no longer alone. Days later, the same shift appeared again, subtle, controlled, impossible to ignore. Only now, the person who noticed wasn't just observing. They were waiting, watching, wondering, and the truth was getting closer. But the moment that transformed a quiet observation into a life-altering turning point was still ahead, coming quietly, without warning, and in a way no one expected. Because the day everything shifted didn't end with that hesitation. It began with it. And what happened next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. In the royal world, routine is a shield. As long as everything looks normal, no one questions what's happening beneath the surface. The monarchy depends on predictability, on the belief that the next generation is ready, steady, and unshakable. So when William continued with his duties, the palace exhaled. Everything looked fine. Everything appeared stable. Everything returned to script. Except it didn't. Because the shift didn't disappear, it followed him. A few days later, it appeared again. Different setting. Different room. Same hesitation. It happened during a private briefing. Nothing emotional, nothing personal, just another meeting filled with schedules, decisions, and expectations. William listened, nodding at the right moments, giving the expected responses, but there was a difference this time. His focus drifted, not because he wasn't paying attention, but because something internal was louder than the conversation around him. The person across the table paused mid-sentence, not because of what William said, but because of what he didn't. His eyes weren't distant in a distracted way. They were distant in a reflective way, like a man who suddenly realized he was listening to a life he never chose. He blinked, returned to the moment, and continued as if nothing had happened. But the pause was there, barely noticeable, yet impossible to unsee once witnessed. Later that afternoon, another shift, not in behavior, in presence. He stood near a window for a moment longer than necessary, watching people outside moving freely, unaware, unbothered, unrestricted. It wasn't longing. It was recognition, the kind that comes when a person sees something they forgot existed. Choice, free movement, unwatched existence, unscripted life. Most people would have dismissed the moment as simple reflection. But the person who observed it felt something deeper. This wasn't someone overwhelmed. This was someone awakening. An awakening is far more dangerous than breaking. When someone breaks, the world reacts. When someone awakens, the world doesn't notice until it's too late to reverse. Over the next week, small moments continued stacking, not dramatic enough to draw attention, but consistent enough to create a pattern. He began asking quieter questions, not directly about himself, but about systems, traditions, expectations. Do these roles ever change? Has anyone ever stepped back? What happens if someone can't continue? Harmless questions on the surface, loaded questions underneath. Questions that should never come from the heir to the throne. And yet, no one in the room reacted. Because the royal institution is trained to hear words without hearing meaning. The only person who noticed the shift was the same person who witnessed the first hesitation. At this point, it wasn't concern, it was certainty. Something had changed inside him, and it wasn't temporary. But here's where the turning point truly began. The shift didn't come from pressure increasing. It came from resistance disappearing. William wasn't struggling to hold himself together. He had stopped pretending he didn't feel the weight. And that difference changes everything. Because when someone finally allows themselves to acknowledge the truth, even silently, their life begins moving in a new direction, whether they intend it or not. And that direction was becoming undeniable. A few evenings later, a small gathering took place. Informal, comfortable, the kind of setting where titles matter less and humanity matters more. People were talking, laughing, sharing stories. Normal, uncomplicated. William was part of the conversation, but not anchored to it. He smiled at the right moments. He responded politely. He appeared engaged. But the person watching him saw what no one else did. His smile faded too quickly. His eyes drifted between words. He wasn't tired. He was detached. Not from people. From role. As if the life around him felt separate from the person inside him. Moments later, something subtle but telling happened. Someone made a light comment. A joke about responsibilities, the kind most people would laugh off easily. William didn't laugh. Not because he was offended, but because the comment wasn't funny to him anymore. It hit differently, like a reminder instead of a joke. He looked down for a moment. Just 1 second. But that second carried meaning. A realization. What others found amusing, he found heavy. The room moved on instantly. But the person watching didn't. Because that was the moment the shift stopped being a question and became an answer. Something inside him had crossed a line, silently but decisively. And once someone crosses that line, they don't return to who they were before. Not emotionally, not mentally, not internally, even if everything outside stays the same. Within days, the change was visible again, this time during a private discussion about future duties. He wasn't resistant. He wasn't frustrated. He was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet, the contemplative quiet. The kind that signals a person is no longer assuming their future is fixed. The person leading the discussion didn't notice, but the observer did. Because now the shift wasn't occasional, it was constant. William wasn't struggling with his role. He was questioning his relationship with it. And that distinction is what turned a subtle moment into the beginning of a life-altering trajectory. Most people go their entire lives without confronting the difference between obligation and identity. William reached that boundary in silence. And silence is where the truth first begins to speak. But the moment that transformed quiet observation into an irreversible turning point was still approaching, waiting in a setting no one expected and unfolding in a way no one could ignore. Because the day everything shifted didn't end with subtle signs. It was building toward one moment, one conversation, one sentence that would change the future forever. And what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment finally arrived on an evening that should have been uneventful. No royal event. No official duties. Just a quiet end to a long day. William was alone in a small sitting room. Not grand, not ceremonial, just a private space used when the world wasn't looking. The kind of room that didn't appear in photos. The kind reserved for breathing, not performing. The observer entered the room without expecting anything unusual. They assumed William would be reviewing notes, answering messages, preparing for the next day. But instead, he was sitting completely still. Not reading, not writing, not distracted. Just sitting, hands resting loosely, shoulders lowered, not from exhaustion, but from release. Like a man who had finally stopped holding himself upright for everyone else. At first, the observer didn't speak. Something about the moment felt fragile. Not sad, real. After a few seconds, William looked up. His expression wasn't distressed. It wasn't tense. It was calm in a way the observer had never seen before. And that calmness was more unsettling than any visible stress would have been. Because when someone who has spent years carrying silent pressure suddenly stops bracing themselves, it means the weight is no longer being contained. The observer sat down across from him. Not formally, not cautiously, but the way someone sits when they sense a truth is near and doesn't need to be forced. There was no lead-in, no build-up. William spoke first. A simple sentence. Soft. Steady. Have you ever felt like your life was decided before you had a chance to live it? The observer froze. Not because the question was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was sincere, measured, thoughtful. The kind of question a person asks only after thinking about it for a very long time. The observer answered carefully. Most people would say yes at some point. But I don't think your version is the same as anyone else's. William exhaled. Not heavily, just honestly. That's the problem. Everyone thinks they understand. But they don't. There was no anger in his voice. No bitterness. Just clarity. The observer didn't push. Silence filled the room. Not awkward. Not tense. But necessary. Then William continued. I've spent my whole life preparing for something I never chose. Not rebellious. Not emotional. Simply true. The observer felt the shift, not from uncertainty, but from inevitability. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of awareness. William looked toward the window, not dramatically, but thoughtfully. Everyone assumes I've always accepted this path. But the truth is, I never had the chance to decide if I wanted it. The observer's heart tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. This wasn't the hesitation they had seen before. This was the reason behind it. For the first time, the internal struggle had words. Not implied, not hinted, spoken. And spoken truth changes everything. The observer finally asked the only question that made sense. When did you start feeling this way? William didn't hesitate. It started long before I understood what the feeling was. That answer said more than anything he could have explained. Because feelings that begin before understanding are the ones that shape a person. Not suddenly, but permanently. The observer didn't interrupt. William continued. I've done everything expected of me. I've followed every rule. I've carried every responsibility. But there's a difference between accepting a role and belonging to it. Then came the sentence that would stay with the observer forever. And I don't know if this life ever belonged to me. Not dramatic. Not broken. Just true. The room didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. The observer realized that the hesitation from days earlier was not uncertainty. It was the beginning of honesty trying to surface. Honesty that had finally reached a point where silence was no longer possible. The observer wanted to respond, but before they could, William added something even more revealing. I'm not saying I won't do what's expected. I'm saying I never had the chance to want it. That distinction mattered. He wasn't rejecting the crown. He was acknowledging the absence of choice. Choice, the one thing no royal biography ever includes. The observer nodded, not because they understood fully, but because they understood enough. And then it happened. The moment that turned a private reflection into the first step toward a confession that would eventually shake the entire country. William looked directly at the observer and asked the question that changed everything. Do you think it's possible for someone to live a life they were never meant for and still survive it? Not physically, emotionally. The observer didn't answer right away. There are questions that don't require immediate responses, only realization. Because that wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Recognition that he had reached a threshold people rarely cross without consequence. The observer finally spoke quietly. It depends on whether they continue living the life, or finally admit they don't want it. William didn't react outwardly, but the silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Not empty, not uncertain, deciding. And that was the moment, the exact moment. The shift transformed into something irreversible. Not because the world knew, but because he knew. Once a person admits a truth to themselves, even silently, the path ahead changes. Even if they say nothing more. Even if they continue as expected. The observer understood one thing with chilling clarity. This was only the beginning. Because no one asks a question like that unless they are already standing at the edge of a decision. And what happened next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Imagine carrying a weight you never asked for. Not something you picked up by accident. Not something you tried and failed at. But a weight placed on your shoulders before you even understood what it meant. That was the life of Prince William. The monarchy has always been a carefully constructed machine. Each heir groomed from birth. Every gesture calculated. Every misstep noted and corrected before it could even happen. William grew up inside that machine, moving through corridors that echoed with expectation and silence, learning lessons nobody taught aloud. Lessons about obedience, about stoicism, about never questioning the role written for you before your first breath. And yet, the paradox of his existence was this. He was born to privilege, yet denied the most fundamental freedom, choice. While other children ran and stumbled and laughed without consequence, he was being molded into the face of a nation. Every word, every movement, every smile measured. The price for perfection was invisibility. The world would never see the strain, the doubt, the private rebellion simmering beneath his composed exterior. Even as a boy, William knew he was different, not in the sense of talent or temperament, but in expectation. His mother, Diana, was adored by the world, a brilliant combination of warmth and vulnerability. The public adored her, the cameras never looked away. But William knew that admiration came at a cost. Every public smile, every display of empathy, was dissected and judged. If his mother could not fully escape the scrutiny of the world, how much harder would it be for him, the heir apparent? By the time he reached adolescence, the burden was unmistakable. He attended schools where the curriculum extended beyond academics. It included lessons in duty, behavior, posture, restraint. He learned to hide disappointment, frustration, and exhaustion. Failure was unacceptable, and success alone was never enough. It had to be perfect, visible, and continuous. Every birthday, every family event, every public appearance reminded him, this life was not his to choose. It belonged to history, to tradition, to duty. And though he performed with precision, the growing pressure left cracks in his composure. Moments of doubt flickered like candle flames in an otherwise well-lit room. Small, fragile, almost invisible, but persistent. The irony is cruel. Many people assumed he lived a charmed life, that wealth and status insulated him from ordinary human concerns. But the reality was far darker. Freedom had been exchanged for expectation. The ability to make mistakes had been replaced with rehearsed perfection. Spontaneity was forbidden. And choice? That was a luxury he would never know. As he matured, the internal tension intensified. Friendships were complicated by his public position, intimacy shadowed by obligation, and even hobbies were scrutinized for appropriateness. Every action carried weight. Every decision had consequences far beyond what any ordinary teenager could imagine. His identity, once something fluid and evolving, became predefined. Who he was, really, was secondary to who he was supposed to be. And yet, William endured. He smiled. He performed. He achieved. He became the man the monarchy required. But inside, there was a quiet, unrelenting question that never left him. What if I don't want this? That question stayed hidden for years, unspoken, because expressing it was unthinkable. To question the path was not merely personal, it was revolutionary. A threat to centuries of tradition. A crack in the veneer of continuity the monarchy could never allow. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, quietly, in the smallest gestures. It appeared in a pause during an otherwise ordinary conversation. It appeared in fleeting glances out of the window, watching ordinary people navigate lives without scripts or handlers. It appeared in the way he sometimes lingered over decisions that would normally be automatic, as if weighing not just the consequence, but the personal cost he had never been permitted to calculate. The burden of expectation, invisibly stitched into every aspect of his life, had grown heavy enough to be felt, even by those closest to him. And that's the extraordinary thing about carrying a burden no one sees. It isolates you, even among people who love you. The crown can protect, can dignify, can elevate, but it cannot comfort. It cannot free the individual from the knowledge that they are not living a life they chose. By the time he reached adulthood, William's awareness of the burden had transformed. It was no longer just a vague dissatisfaction. It was a defining reality. Each public appearance, each meticulously planned engagement, reminded him of the life he was required to perform. And each private moment, the moments unseen by the world, reminded him of the life he would never have. The contrast was striking. On one hand, he moved among crowds with charm, with confidence, with the certainty expected of a future king. On the other hand, in private, he wrestled with isolation, doubt, and a gnawing longing for autonomy. The dichotomy was exhausting. It created a tension that could never be acknowledged aloud, because acknowledgement itself would be seen as weakness, or worse, rebellion. And yet, there were rare moments when the burden slipped into view. Moments when a careless gesture, a quiet sigh, or a fleeting hesitation revealed what lay beneath the polished exterior. These moments were tiny, almost imperceptible to the public eye, but not to those who watched him closely. And to the observer who would eventually hear his confession, they were enough to foreshadow the truth. William's resignation was not a sudden emotional outburst. It had been building for decades. The burden he carried was complex. It was not just the weight of expectation, the glare of public attention, or the obligations of royalty. It was also the internal conflict between duty and self, between heritage and humanity, between who he was born to be and who he wanted to become. And that conflict, unrelenting, created a tension that could no longer be contained. By understanding the weight he carried, we begin to understand why the confession, simple, quiet, human, was so profoundly shocking. It was not merely an emotional admission. It was the culmination of a lifetime of unseen struggle, a lifetime of rehearsed smiles, measured gestures, and controlled emotion finally yielding to one undeniable truth. This life was not the one he wanted. And the truth, once spoken, changes everything. Because a burden this deep cannot remain hidden forever. It leaks into presence, into words, into actions. And for William, that leakage began in ways subtle, gradual, and impossible to ignore. It appeared first in hesitations, in reflective moments, in fleeting glances that hinted at longing and doubt. And as the days and months went by, those small signs grew, becoming impossible for even the closest confidants to dismiss. He carried the monarchy's legacy on his shoulders, yet the burden of personal identity weighed just as heavily. The two forces were at odds, constantly, and the tension could no longer remain balanced. The internal struggle, long private, long silent, was moving toward a tipping point, and that tipping point would arrive sooner than anyone imagined. Because the burden he never chose was not just a personal struggle, it was the prelude to a confession that would ultimately leave the UK in shock. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Even decades later, her presence lingered. Not physically, not visibly, but in ways that shaped him every single day. Princess Diana, the mother he adored, the figure the world idolized. Left behind more than legacy, she left a shadow, one that stretched across corridors, photographs, engagements, and every carefully curated public appearance. For William, Diana was both inspiration and reminder. She had navigated a world of impossible expectations with grace and empathy, yet even she could not escape scrutiny. Every smile, every gesture dissected, every emotion weighed and catalogued. Observers often praised her warmth, but those closest to her knew the toll of living a life constantly observed, constantly judged. And William inherited that knowledge long before he fully understood it. As a boy, he watched her carefully. He absorbed lessons silently. The need to appear composed while feeling fragile, the need to perform kindness while enduring intrusion, the necessity of controlling one's image because the world would define you before you could define yourself. These lessons were etched into him, not in textbooks, not in conversations, but in living examples of restraint and vigilance. Yet there was another lesson, far subtler and far more dangerous. Diana was human, and her humanity was vulnerable to the pressures of royalty. She could be loved and criticized at the same time, celebrated and scrutinized simultaneously. She had shown him that perfection demanded sacrifice, and often, that sacrifice came at the cost of personal freedom. The weight of that realization sank into William early. Every time he glanced at old photographs, every time he heard the world's praises for her poise, he felt a combination of admiration and fear. He admired her courage, her grace, her ability to navigate scrutiny with dignity. He feared the same fate for himself, to be adored by many while truly understood by none, trapped in a life defined by expectation, not choice. It was not guilt that haunted him, it was anticipation. He knew the moment he would be forced to step fully into his role would come, and he feared whether he would survive it emotionally, even if he performed it flawlessly. The shadow of Diana's life was not in her mistakes, but in her vulnerability, the way the public could consume, interpret, and manipulate even her most intimate moments. William carried that lesson into adulthood, silently bracing himself against an invisible storm that he had no way to control. By the time he reached his teens, this awareness had become a constant companion. Friends noticed moments of withdrawal, of reflection, of quiet intensity. Teachers observed a seriousness beyond his years, a preoccupation with responsibility that seemed disproportionate to his age. And family, they saw the diligence and dedication expected of an heir, but they could not fully see the emotional tension that came with it. This tension, like an invisible weight, followed him through every formative moment. Schoolwork, extracurriculars, friendships, vacations, all were measured against the standard of the future king. Every success was lauded, every minor misstep quietly corrected. But beneath the surface, William wrestled with questions that had no safe space for answers. Questions like, do I belong here? Do I want this? And if not, what happens when the expectation is greater than my own desire? Even in his 20s, the shadow remained. The public saw him growing into his role, confident, capable, charismatic. Yet in private, the weight was palpable. The observer who would eventually hear his confession later described the subtle signs, moments of hesitation, reflective pauses, glances toward the horizon, as if searching for a life that might exist elsewhere. These were not flaws. They were expressions of an internal struggle, a wrestling match between duty and desire. The pressure was compounded by the absence of Diana. Her guidance, her support, her presence had been a balancing force. With her gone, the shadow grew darker. Decisions that might have once been eased by her counsel now loomed larger, heavier, and more isolating. William was no longer just himself. He was the embodiment of legacy, expectation, and history. Every move carried weight beyond his comprehension at times, and every public misstep could trigger scrutiny and disappointment. What made this burden invisible to the outside world was William's mastery of composure. He learned to perform the part seamlessly, to smile when required, to appear untroubled in the presence of crowds, to convey assurance without betraying doubt. The skill is remarkable, but it comes at a cost. Every act of composure was a suppression of authentic self, every gesture a negotiation between identity and expectation. The shadow of Diana reminded him that even perfection could not guarantee peace. By the time he was preparing to take on adult responsibilities, William's internal struggle had evolved. It was no longer just about performing. It was about reconciling two opposing forces, the inherited duty to the monarchy and the personal desire for autonomy. Every decision, every engagement, every step forward carried with it a dual significance. Was he doing it because he believed in the role, or because he had been trained to accept it unquestioningly? These questions haunted him privately, manifesting in reflective moments during official duties. A handshake might feel mechanical. A smile might fade faster than intended. A pause in conversation might signal contemplation of a life beyond the constraints of royalty. Those who observed closely could see these subtle signals, the almost imperceptible cracks in the polished exterior that hinted at the inner struggle. And yet, William persevered. The shadow of his mother, while daunting, also served as a compass. Her example reminded him of the power of empathy, the importance of dignity, and the necessity of resilience. But shadows are double-edged. They guide, but they also constrain. The weight of Diana's legacy was both inspiration and burden. It compelled him to maintain perfection, yet constantly reminded him of the cost of conformity. It is in this context that the confession, the one that would later leave the UK in shock, gains its true significance. This was not a spur-of-the-moment emotional outburst. It was the culmination of decades spent navigating expectation, legacy, and the complex interplay between public duty and private desire. It was the expression of a lifelong tension, made visible for the first time in words, in honesty, in a quiet but irreversible moment of clarity. Because the shadow of Diana is not simply the memory of a mother. It is the awareness of consequence, of visibility, of scrutiny, and of the inevitability of expectation. Every decision William made, every smile he performed, every pause he allowed in private, all were shaped by this shadow. And when the moment came to speak the truth, it carried with it the weight of that entire legacy. The public would later see him composed, dutiful, and measured, as always. They would never fully understand the emotional context behind the pause, the glance, the question, or the unspoken tension. The shadow, invisible yet ever-present, would remain largely hidden. Only those who were close enough, those who witnessed the quiet evolution of his internal struggle, could perceive the magnitude of what had been carried in silence. And it was this silent accumulation, this invisible weight, that set the stage for a moment that would forever alter the perception of the future king. A moment in which decades of preparation, expectation, and internal conflict converged. A moment when the heir to the throne finally allowed himself to acknowledge, even in the presence of another, the human truth that had been overshadowed for too long, that the life chosen for him was not the life he truly wanted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. There is a system the public rarely sees. A world of structure, protocol, and expectation that surrounds every move of the heir to the throne. The palace, with all its grandeur and history, is more than walls, tapestries, and ceremonial halls. It is a carefully orchestrated machine, a machine designed to shape behavior, silence deviation, and maintain the illusion of perfection. For Prince William, this machine has been his constant companion since birth. Every step he took, every word he spoke, was influenced by it. The machine does not accommodate individuality. It does not allow for doubt. It does not forgive hesitation. Its purpose is singular, to produce an heir who embodies continuity, stability, and unquestionable duty. From the outside, William appeared composed, charming, steady, polished, the face of the monarchy everyone expected to see. But inside, the machine's influence was relentless, subtle, and omnipresent. It controlled more than schedule or behavior. It dictated identity. It determined what was appropriate to feel, when to feel it, and how to present it. Every day was a series of instructions disguised as responsibilities. Public engagements, meetings with dignitaries, charity events, all orchestrated down to the second. There were advisors, assistants, handlers, and staff whose sole purpose was to ensure that the heir performed flawlessly, without pause or deviation. Even minor lapses could create ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate moment. And yet, the machine is not just mechanical, it is psychological. Its influence penetrates beyond visible actions. It shapes thought, constrains desire, and imposes unspoken rules that are more powerful than any formal command. William learned early that deviation could be dangerous, not because of punishment, but because of the social and emotional consequences it triggered. Imagine growing up knowing that every minor emotion you display is scrutinized and interpreted, that your natural impulses are constantly measured against centuries of expectation, that your personal struggles, doubts, and desires are secondary to the image of the heir you are expected to become. For William, this was reality. It shaped his thoughts, his habits, and ultimately, his identity. The palace provides guidance and structure, but it also imposes restraint. Personal freedom is secondary. Choice is limited to acceptable parameters. Even relationships, friendships, and moments of spontaneity are subtly constrained. Every action is calculated, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through the invisible pressures of tradition. The result is a life where the internal and external selves rarely align. As William matured, the influence of the machine intensified. Public scrutiny increased, responsibilities multiplied, and the consequences of failure became more severe. Every decision was weighed not just for personal outcome, but for historical significance. The machine had one goal: ensure that the heir embodied the role of future king without question or hesitation. But humans are not machines. And no matter how sophisticated or disciplined, a human mind cannot operate indefinitely under such constant expectation without friction. Subtle cracks begin to appear.